elevating the discussion while talking about the things that matter most. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Hey, once again, welcome to Society and the State. Brian Hyde here along with Connor Boyack. And, there's a lot of negative stuff that floats around on the internet about law enforcement. Maybe it's because we all have cameras on our phones and people are able to film things as they're happening. And frankly, there's some pretty alarming stuff on any given day that makes its way to the internet that if you weren't careful would convince you that law enforcement generally is kind of out of control. They can do whatever they want. They can abuse the citizenry if they want. And so there's a lot of negativity. Today, we actually have some good news. In fact, today we actually have an example of maybe a good illustration of the difference between what a law enforcer would do versus what a peace officer would do. And Connor, I'm going to ask you to kind of set the stage because I know you saw this story and mentioned it. I've talked about it on my radio show, but an officer in Minnesota was called to do a welfare check on an elderly woman. And what did he find when he went to check on her?
So, he knocks on the door, is talking to this woman and inquiring what was going on. As Brian, as you point out, was doing a welfare check. Basically, we want to make sure things are okay. Found that she was just fine, but she was unable to, mow her grass. That was kind of one of the situations that she was going on. Now, instead of ticketing said woman and citing them, most city ordinances have landscaping limits, and they have these laws in place so that if someone's lawns or weeds and so forth get out of control, they can be cited as a way to bring them into compliance. But this officer, to his credit, did not only not provide any citation to the woman, but went above and beyond and actually mowed her lawn. And super interesting because in so many cases, you see that this is precisely the opposite of what happens. In fact, there are stories from across the country. There's even one here in our backyard in Utah where an officer roughed up a woman because he was going to her house over this kind of dead lawn issue that happened, and things escalated a bit, and this elderly woman got roughed up and her nose was kind of cracked open and bleeding and so forth. You've seen a case in Texas. A 75-year-old woman had a warrant issued for her arrest for tall grass. We see these stories percolate up in the news from time to time. And Brian, what strikes me about this story and this example is really the contrast that it sets up, because I think what we see a lot of times is kind of the robotic law enforcement officer and Borg-like, right? Resistance is futile. You must comply. I'm just doing my job. But then you see the contrast of an officer who's taking the time on the clock, on the taxpayer clock, to rather than harass and cause problems for this woman who may be unable to pay the citation or get down to court on her date and so forth. Just that would create an injustice. Rather than doing that, this officer decides to actually solve the problem, address the exact situation, and mow the lawn for her. In my mind, that's more of a peace officer. We see oftentimes on the cars of police officers, it says, keeping the peace, right? And that's kind of the mantra of the profession. But in so many cases, I think they are the maybe not instigators. It's probably the lawmakers who are instigating these situations in which these altercations can occur. But certainly they are perpetuating confrontation by
escalating it.
Or escalating. Great, thank you, perfect. But here we see someone who is legitimately trying to keep the peace by saying, "Look, the right thing to do here is to just solve the problem." And I don't know. I like that example because it sets up a bit of a duality, right? On the one hand, you've got you must comply, and here we've got look, let me just help you out and carry on about our day.
Yeah, I have a number of friends who are police officers, and I love them because the ones who are my friends are the kind of guys who will ask themselves regularly, am I part of the problem or am I part of the solution? And I really believe their emphasis is more on being a peace officer and not unnecessarily trying to hook people up. Now, one of them, who's a highway patrolman, said, that's a lot easier to do in a more small town setting. He says, when you get to a bigger city or you get to a more impersonal kind of setting where there's a large population, that can be tough because you're never going to see this person again. So if you pull them over because their license plate light isn't functional, or they didn't signal for 2 seconds before they changed lanes, you can hook them up, write them a ticket, put a fine on them, and there's a really good chance you're never going to see them again in your life. But if it's a member of your community, like if you're in a small town,
yeah,
and you go putting the cuffs on somebody for something relatively minor, that's something that's going to come back to visit you. And that's not to say that they maybe didn't do something wrong, but how you handle it and the discretion that you exercise isn't just going to affect you, but it's going to affect your kids who go to school with their kids, or your wife who bumps into their wife while shopping at the grocery store. And I love his approach. And I don't know how you bridge that gap, in larger populations.
You used a very interesting word, Brian, that I think is the operative word in the situation, and that is discretion. We see it all the time, right? Officer pulls someone over and, the guy's wife is in labor in the car, right? That officer would be ill-advised to detain them and write them a ticket. It's like, okay, well, let me escort you or go on your way. Just try and not drive recklessly or whatever. There are situations in which an officer can say, look, the right thing here to do is not enforce the law. That would be an injustice. I'm going to give you a warning instead. The officer is not required to write someone up or to arrest someone. They can use their discretion. So too with the prosecutor. They can decline to file charges when the officer has now arrested someone or seized property or whatever. The prosecutor can say, no, look, I think it's in the interest of justice to decline this or to lower the charges, drop some of the charges. They have discretion. And that, I think, is the difference between the law enforcement officer and the peace officer, who's recognizing, like, look, if you're a danger to society, then it makes sense to use my authority to try and detain you, stop the situation or whatever. But hey, look, if I'm trying to escalate the situation or create confrontation where none exists, I would be the instrument of injustice. Therefore, I'm going to use my discretion to de-escalate. There's a story that made the rounds recently, Brian. I'm sure you heard about this because now the Institute for Justice is involved, in which discretion was not used. This is the story of Jim Ficken. And this gentleman was in Florida. And last year, he was out of town helping with some stuff with his mother's estate. And his grass, of course, kept growing. And he had arranged for someone to cut his grass while he was away. But that individual died, and Ficken had no idea. So the person he had kind of coordinated to mow his lawn and keep it well kept passed away. So the grass keeps growing. Meanwhile, this guy thought his lawn was being taken care of. Well, because the grass grew over, 10 inches, which is the city ordinance, the city starts claiming that he owed them money, because that, of course, is the right remedy to, try and resolve a situation peacefully and keep a community whole and intact and friendly and so forth. We're going to make you pay us.
Compliance.
And every single day that this guy's grass was over the limit, they were saying that he owed the city $500 every day, because that was treated as a separate violation for every individual day. It wasn't just, hey, $500 and then get it cut. It was, no, every day that you're out of compliance, you owe us $500, because magically, apparently, that solves problems. Well, this went on for 2 months, accruing up to, I think it reached about $30,000. In fact, we'll link to this story and the other one that we introed the episode with on societyinthestate.com/153, so you can read a little bit more about it. But this accrues up to almost $30,000. And so to try and recoup the money that they're supposedly owed, what happens? Well, now they're going after his house and trying to take his home. So now the Institute for Justice is involved. They're suing the city over these fines imposed without due process over the mowed lawn. But that to me just shows the absurdity of law, the lack of discretion to say, oh, okay, look, mistake, we get it, we'll make an exception. And just this robotic, as you point out, Brian, compliance at all costs. We must enforce the law. We're a society of rule of law. What happens if we don't start following the law? It'll be chaos and anarchy. It's just mind-boggling that I live in a society in which people like this have power and can do this kind of stupid stuff to another human being.
When I hear about what's happening to Mr. Ficken, and I have to try to imagine what's going on in the minds of city officials who are nonetheless pushing forward. Nope, his grass was over 10 inches. We have every right to do this. I want to paraphrase our late great friend Will Grigg by saying, there are some people who are a couple of good stout horsewhippings shy of being a good human being. It's so aggravating. And yet you look at the officer who mowed the woman's lawn in Minnesota. She was obviously in a position where mowing her lawn was more than she could handle. She didn't have someone hired to come and mow her lawn. Right. So putting a fine on her, and you're one of the people who opened my mind to this. Oftentimes the fines for these infractions or these indiscretions actually compound the problem that they're supposedly trying to get somebody to solve. So yeah, we're going to stick a fine on you, ma'am. And then you can enjoy, eating cat food for the rest of the month. while you go get somebody to mow your lawn. But because he handled it the way that he did, because that officer went and mowed her lawn, and then his partner took a picture of it and they put it on their Facebook page,
Right.
Public awareness was raised, and members of the community, including her neighbors, rallied around her and stepped forward and said, "Hey, how can we help? We'll make sure that your lawn is cut." Problem solved.
Problem solved. Actual community, a community solution to a non-government problem.
Yeah, I don't know that anybody will ever convince me that that's somehow a worse way. No, they should have fined her and maybe even a little jail time, because I saw how high her lawn was. No, if it's about really solving a problem, don't make the problem bigger in the name of trying to solve it.
There's another story, Brian, that comes to mind. This also happened recently, just about a week or so ago, of a couple in Denver, Colorado being charged with felonies for short-term rental violations. And the city is trying to crack down. Now, there's some nuance to the story. The ordinance in Denver requires apparently that you live in the home, which makes some sense because then you have as much interest in making sure there's no nuisances and no rowdy people and so forth to make sure that the neighbors aren't experiencing a problem, because if you're in the home as well, you're going to want to sleep. So in some respects, that makes sense. And apparently what this couple has done is to try and be able to do their short-term rentals, but they don't live in the house. They've falsely claimed that it is their primary residence, and so they've been caught. But that just shows the circuitous way in which people are trying to navigate these arcane and arbitrary ordinances to be able to use their property as they're intended. No one, as I've researched this story, I can't find any complaints about actual nuisances like a party house, 3 a.m., trash all over the lawn, 20 cars out front. Like, I haven't been able to identify any actual problem, just that, oh no, they used their home in this way and that violates our laws. Felonies.
That's pretty serious.
Right. And so here again, we see like not peace officer, not community, not like any reasonable effort to try and allow people to enjoy their property rights and just keep the peace between neighbors. Here we see instead compliance and robotic. You must follow the law. We are now going to enforce our ordinance and turn these people into felons because they're peacefully, from what I can tell so far, sharing their homes with other people to their mutual benefit. It's nuts.
Can I give you a quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn that I think kind of sums up why these things need to be questioned and why we should handle them in ways other than just, well, let's pass a law or let's have a policy and let the police handle it. Solzhenitsyn, when he was talking to the graduating class of Harvard in 1978, talked about how the letter of the law is too cold and formal to have a beneficial influence on society. And he says, whenever the tissue of life is woven of legalistic relationships, this creates an atmosphere of spiritual mediocrity that paralyzes man's noblest pulses.
Wow.
That just rings true.
I was trying to find this, Brian, and I can't. You'll perhaps better be able to quote it, but it's one of the quotes from the Federalist saying, like, it'll be little use to have to elect people of your own choosing if the laws that they write are so voluminous and so confusing that people can't understand them, right?
That's James Madison.
And so, and I was trying to find it. I'll see if I can find it later and throw it on the show notes page. But to me, like, that's very illustrative of the problem. In a law enforcement society, there's all these statutes and ordinances and regulations on the books that everyone becomes a criminal. We've talked about this in a past episode. We're basically all felons, right? There's a book by Harvey Silverglate, 3 Felonies a Day. Like, there's so many laws on the books that people can't understand them, right? Like, the gentleman in Florida probably didn't know that he'd be having to pay $500 every day for having a lawn that's too long. And so if there's all these laws turning us all into criminals, what's the point of a representative system of elected individuals if the end result of that is just this system of oppression in which robotic law enforcement officers can just crush us under their boot and ensure compliance when we've deviated so far from this limited government, respect property rights, keep the peace type of system?
One of those approaches cultivates the kind of approach that we saw in Minnesota, where this officer actually stepped up and helped the woman solve her problem without trying to impose some kind of penalty or otherwise hold her accountable before the law. The other one cultivates a gotcha mentality.
Yeah.
Which one do you think would make a better community to live in?
The question answers itself. All right, guys, we'll put some of these resources on the show notes page, societyandthestate.com/153. Important to consider as we work to reform laws and try and improve our communities. We want peace officers. We want folks keeping the peace and discretion being used, not these robotic compliance, Borg-like mentality. So a lot of work to do, obviously, to try and make sure that stories like the ones we've shared aren't happening in our communities. Make sure you're subscribed, and we'll see you guys on the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.